thank you to everybody for coming along to this paper. So the paper is entitled Human Vulnerability, Social Reproduction and the Pandemic. What I want to focus on is how the COVID-19 pandemic, how that has brought up issues and questions relating both to the existence of universal human vulnerability and also the role of socially reproductive work, especially caregiving, both within the home and outside of the home. Okay, so I'm now going to, the problem is I can't actually see my slides, so I'm hoping that, has it now gone on to the second slide? No? Okay, that's a bit okay.
Yeah, no.
It has now.
It has, okay,
yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, brilliant. Right, so I'll begin by sort of setting the theoretical scene for what I'm going to be discussing. So I'm coming at this from a vulnerability theory perspective. So vulnerability theory is a way of analysing law and policy through the lens of vulnerability, which acknowledges that all of us, by virtue of being human and being embodied beings, that we're all fundamentally vulnerable and we're all susceptible to harm, whether that is kind of unexpected harm such as accident or injury, or whether it's just the process of the life course itself, which actually is probably a bit of an error calling that harmful necessarily, but it's a kind of inevitable biological process that we can't change. So it's that fact that makes us vulnerable. And I've put a quote here from Martha Feynman, who's a leading proponent of that theory. That we live with the ever-present possibility of harm and injury, and that's something that we cannot avoid. And because we're all embodied beings, it also means that we're reliant on constant nurture and care for our survival. So I mean, on a kind of very basic level, just things like sort of sleep and food and drink, but obviously there are also many people who are directly dependent on others just to meet their very basic needs. So obviously very young children would fall into that category. Some elderly people might, some people with disabilities might as well. So social reproduction is kind of a broad umbrella term to cover lots of different things in terms of sustaining and reproducing the population. But what I'm focused on here is predominantly sort of care work, so the work that goes into looking after people who can't meet basic needs themselves. And the argument that vulnerability theorists make, and which I agree with, is that largely the state, whether through kind of policy making and through lawmaking, tends to ignore the reality of embodiment and dependency. So instead, laws and policies tend to be based on a kind of hypothetical person who is able-bodied, who isn't troubled by their body, and in fact, people who do exhibit kind of visible evidence of embodiment that they can't conceal, so they can't pretend to be invulnerable, such as people who are very elderly or people with disability. Often those kind of things are othered and stigmatized. What I also argue is that social reproduction, the work that goes into social reproduction, so the caregiving work, a lot of that is sort of devalued, it's privatized and kind of confined to the private family, so it's not seen as having any value outside it. And on a kind of more general level, even if care work is paid, it tends to be devalued and often is sort of seen as unskilled as well. I've put a quote there from Greer about how this hypothetical person sort of the qualities that they possess. So that the autonomous liberal subject is a human adult male standing in a highly selective relation to developmental time and processes, always paradigmatically fully formed and functional. So it's this idea that we base our kind of or the state bases its laws and its policy around somebody who embodies those qualities, rather than somebody who is embodied and in need of care and is episodically dependent on other people. So that's the theoretical stuff. And now I'm going to come on and have a look at the so hopefully that will have changed the slide again. So I'm now going to look at how the pandemic has kind of brought out some of those issues and how it's brought them to the forefront. So one thing that the pandemic has done is it's exposed the nature of universal human vulnerability, that all of us, even if we're rich or privileged in other ways, that we are ultimately embodied and we are susceptible to harm. And in this case, we're talking about harm from this virus. And it's also revealed a kind of how fragile our state structures and general social structures are, that it just takes this one thing to bring everything kind of crashing down. And it's something, whereas sort of liberal, neoliberal state policies are often based on this idea of humans being in control of the environment, being in control of sort of economic growth and everything like that. But actually that's very fragile, because now we've kind of had evidence of our own fragility, and that's something that the state has had to accept. I think certainly at the beginning of the pandemic there was acceptance of that. So whilst we've had years and years of these neoliberal policies based on individualism and people looking out just for themselves and not caring for others, suddenly we realise that actually what other people do has a direct impact on us. So, you know, I don't know, maybe it's just me going to the shop at the beginning of the pandemic and being terrified that there was someone in there who might have the virus. I've calmed down since then. I'm not too fazed by it now, but certainly that idea that actually what other people do directly impacts on us. So that facade was shattered. So in a way that was good, in that it, I mean, just from a theoretical viewpoint, in that it does kind of show what vulnerability theorists have been arguing. But it's also created huge pressure on people who perform social reproduction, because the pandemic has also revealed how essential social reproduction or socially reproductive work, especially caregiving, how essential that is, how much we rely on it, how much we rely on caregiving in particular. And there were sort of awful stories at the beginning of the pandemic from Spain, where elderly people were just kind of abandoned and died as a result because they weren't receiving care. So we realised how desperately we rely on these people and how much we need these people. But at the same time, the conditions that have been created by the pandemic, so sort of lockdowns and things like that, have had an adverse effect on people who perform socially reproductive labour. And I should have said before as well, socially reproductive labour is sort of, the distribution is very gendered. So it's still the case that women do more of this work than men. So the research that's being done on the impacts of the pandemic, the impacts of the lockdown, have shown already that women are kind of doing more of this caregiving, unpaid work in the home. So I've got I've got a link there to the Office for National Statistics, saying that women have performed 2/3 more of the childcare than men during the pandemic, because one of the big things that happened obviously was during the lockdown and school closures and things like that, that there was that additional burden then on people who are parents to also not only kind of do their job, their paid job, but also to do homeschooling alongside of that, and that seems to have been unevenly distributed. So I've referred to a crisis of depletion. So depletion is sort of a reference to the harm that people who perform social reproductive labour that they suffer. So it's the impact of doing social reproduction or socially reproductive work in a society that doesn't value it and doesn't provide supportive resources. So it can consist of psychological, physical, economic harms, so various harms. So it's created it's exacerbating existing problems there, and showing that there's there's a real issue that needs to be addressed by the state urgently. Right, so I'm going to switch to the next slide as well, which is where I'm going to talk about. So I'm just going to now go on to talk a little bit about the kind of the general discourse around the pandemic and how that relates to embodiment. And something that was quite sort of troubling with the pandemic was something that is still quite troubling. I think at the beginning there was this acceptance that, you know, of kind of that we need to care for other people, and that we're all in the same boat. We all need to kind of pull together. We need to look after one another, which represented quite a change from the kind of normal way that the Conservative government deals with things. But it's slowly given way, not just sort of official discourse from the government, but also how the media has reported on the pandemic. It's given way to quite a sort of troubling way of reporting, both on embodiment, the reality of embodiment, and also on people who perform socially reproductive work. Because something that became evident also at the beginning of the pandemic was that people were not necessarily all experiencing the pandemic uniformly. So one group of people who were under particular pressure were people who were performing caregiving work. And we have to remember that, you know, over the years, these are people who have constantly been marginalised and kind of devalued, and their work has been described as unskilled. A lot of it is performed by migrants, BAME, and it's not kind of that kind of work that that sort of work is not held in high, it's not given high status within society. And then, as I said, at the beginning of the pandemic, we suddenly realised that actually this work is crucial. We need to kind of be able to sustain people. We need to care for people who are dependent. But within the media, often there is this reference to altruism or heroism as well. So these people were described almost as if, so these are people who died as a result of contracting coronavirus in the course of their work. And they were described as heroes who had kind of, almost as if they'd been in a war and they'd sort of lost their lives they'd sacrificed their lives for the country. But of course, you know, a lot of these lives were sacrificed because there wasn't sufficient protective equipment, because we had a government that for years and years had prioritised economic growth over personal protection. But instead, we glossed over that by this sort of war hero imagery. And also, I think that, you know, the idea of kind of clapping for carers as well, clapping for the NHS and clapping for carers and describing them as heroes. Again, it sort of glosses over the fact that they are lacking in these essential resources that they need in order to stay safe, in order to keep the population sustained. And going, another worrying thing that's come out, and I think is sort of it's still going on. I know we've stopped clapping for carers or banging saucepan lids together or whatever it is, but now there's been a real kind of there are real lines being drawn between different types of bodies. So whilst at the beginning perhaps there was acceptance that all of us inherently are vulnerable, we're all susceptible to contracting dangerous viruses and things like that, just by virtue of being human. But now we started to draw lines between different types of bodies. So we kind of work from a norm of this healthy body that's relatively young, doesn't have any pre-existing conditions, and we compare people to that ideal. And that ideal, I think, corresponds broadly with this autonomous liberal subject that I was talking about before. To the extent that the autonomous liberal subject does have a body, it's one that's that is free from any kind of health complaints or aging or anything like that. It's frozen in time, if you like. So especially, I think, when we talk about the elderly, so although aging is a process that all of us go through unless we die prematurely, so it's something that's going to happen to everybody. It's sort of othered. They're seen as this hyper vulnerable group, and with suggestions that perhaps they could be locked away, or they could be sort of shut away. They could what's it called, shelter or whatever it's called. I've forgotten the exact term that was being used. But they should shut themselves away so that the rest of society who don't have this hyper vulnerability can get on with life as normal. So still pushing this idea of autonomy and individualism, which was quite troubling. And also the focus on underlying health conditions. So when people die of COVID, the first thing we want to know is, well, did they have an underlying health condition? So if we hear about a 40-year-old dying from COVID, well, Betty had an underlying health condition, or she had an underlying health condition, because otherwise it doesn't fit with this idea that it's only it's only the vulnerable or hyper vulnerable bodies and the people who already have health problems that succumb to this, and also I think within that also almost a kind of sense of blame as well, that that we're blaming perhaps elderly people for slowing down the ability to kind of get back to normal, if you like, but also things like telling people that they have a duty to save the NHS by losing weight, for instance. So that was talked about very much when Boris Johnson came out of intensive care, and he immediately said that the only reason why he thought he had it so bad was because he was overweight. So we're told now lose weight to save the NHS, but the only thing that can save the NHS, of course, is the government funding it properly. That is why there's a strain on the NHS, because it has insufficient funding, and it's had insufficient funding for years and years and years. And that's now being revealed. Now it is being tested. But it's nothing new in that sense. But this idea that people are personally responsible for becoming ill and things like that we like to blame people, and also this dichotomy between economic growth on one hand and personal protection on the other, that if we want to get back to a healthy economy, then we have to sacrifice lives, and we have to decide which lives to sacrifice. So that kind of discourse is it's a bit troubling. So it seems, and I think part of the problem part of the reason why our response in this country has been criticised around the world for being quite a poor response to the crisis is partly because we're still clinging on to this notion of these kind of liberal or neoliberal concepts of individualism and things like that. We're still hanging on to that, and it's worrying for people who, well, I think it's worrying in general, but especially for people who kind of have these bodies that we're now labelling as kind of hyper vulnerable or unhealthy. Okay. And then finally, so as I said, a glimmer of hope. I mean, I don't know whether I'm not too optimistic at the moment, actually, in terms of whether the pandemic can actually bring about anything positive, but perhaps it can. I think the one thing that the pandemic has shown is that because it's created this so as I said before, like a lot of these problems, they're pre-existing. So people who did socially reproductive work, they already were under pressure with trying to balance these things with income earning, and they already lived in a society that made it very difficult, and within a state that made it very difficult for people to be able to do that. But it was a lot of that was kind of hidden away. It wasn't brought to the forefront. These problems weren't deemed urgent enough for people to kind of, or for the state to take them seriously. And I guess what has happened here is because we've got this sense of urgency and exceptionality, or exceptional circumstances, that actually now the state is expanding its parameters of what action that it's prepared to take. So one thing, for instance, that has been suggested by feminist scholars for quite a while, and also vulnerability scholars, is this idea of state subsidies or basic income schemes for people who undertake socially reproductive work, especially sort of unpaid socially reproductive work within the home. That is a way of perhaps compensating them for some of the adverse effects that they've faced. I know I'm nearly done. If you're going to remind me of the time. So to compensate them for the essential work that they do, that society is completely reliant on and wouldn't be able to function without, that's never kind of been a real possibility in this country, at least. But perhaps with the pandemic, we've now got a Conservative government that through the furlough scheme is effectively kind of bringing in a form of basic income scheme and sort of state support for salaries and things like that. So it might be that kind of climate, that's something that we can take advantage of to push through schemes that before would have been considered completely out of the question and unworkable, because we can see now that actually if the situation is dire enough, there is actually the money to do that sort of thing. I think that's something that will need to be addressed in the long term, because the situation we have now with people doing socially reproductive work is that they are in this sort of pressured, relatively intolerable or often intolerable situation. Something needs to be done to kind of alleviate that burden. Okay, so thank you.